Sometimes we forget how much a small gesture can mean, Mrs. Goldstein said gently. You may have just given Ethan a moment he'll never forget, and a memory his mom will cherish forever. Ethan looked up, his voice cracking as he spoke. She always tells me to be kind to people because it makes the world better. I didn't think I'd see someone else do it like this. Baron smiled again, but there was a hint of sadness in his expression. Your mom's right. The world needs more people like her. And you. For a moment, it felt like time slowed. Ethan couldn't stop staring at the box in his hands, imagining his mom's face when she opened it. The thought brought a wave of emotion he could barely contain. As Baron stood to leave, he placed a hand briefly on Ethan's shoulder. Take care of her, he said gently. Ethan nodded, tears spilling over. I will. The Goldsteins, still quietly watching, exchanged a meaningful glance. Thank you, young man, Mr. Goldstein said, as Baron turned toward the door. You've reminded us all of what's important. The door jingled softly as Baron and his entourage stepped out. Ethan looked up at Mrs. Goldstein, his voice full of wonder. Is it always like this? Is it okay if I come back here one day when I have more money? Ethan asked shyly. Mrs. Goldstein's eyes softened. Ethan, you're welcome here any time, and next time, you'll have to tell us how much your mom loved her gift. Ethan smiled, holding the gift close to his chest as he walked out of the store. What he didn't yet realize was the ripple effect this one moment would have on his life, and on everyone who witnessed it. He walked home with a spring in his step, the small box safely tucked in his pocket. The afternoon sunlight felt warmer, brighter, as if the world had shifted just a little. His mind raced with anticipation, imagining the moment his mom would open her gift. When Ethan stepped into their modest apartment, he found his mom folding laundry on the couch. She looked up and smiled, her face lighting up in a way that made all of Ethan's hard work feel worth it. Hey, kiddo, she said, brushing a strand of hair from her face. How was your day? Ethan grinned, trying to keep the surprise hidden. Good. You'll see why next week, he said, his excitement barely contained. His mom chuckled, shaking her head. You're always up to something, aren't you? For the next few days, Ethan kept the gift hidden in his room, checking the box each night to make sure it was still there. When his mom's birthday finally arrived, he couldn't wait any longer. Mom, he said that morning, holding out the small, neatly wrapped package. This is for you. Her hands paused mid-air, her expression shifting from curiosity to pure joy as she opened the box. The golden star pendant shimmered in the light, and tears welled up in her eyes. Ethan, it's beautiful, she whispered. Ethan beamed. I wanted you to have something special. You're the best mom ever. She pulled him into a tight hug, her tears falling freely now. You didn't have to do this. Having you is the best gift I could ever ask for. But even as Ethan basked in the warmth of the moment, his thoughts drifted back to the jewelry store and the kindness of the stranger who had made it all possible. In the weeks that followed, Ethan told his mom about the kindness Baron had shown him, and the two of them often talked about the impact of that simple act. It was a lesson that would stay with them forever. Ethan couldn't help but tell anyone who would listen about what happened that day. His story spread to neighbors, teachers, and even his mom's co-workers, who marveled at the generosity of someone as high-profile as Baron Trump. But Baron's act wasn't about fame or recognition. It was a quiet reminder of something Ethan would carry with him for the rest of his life. The power of kindness, Ethan learned, had no price tag. It wasn't about money or status. It was about seeing someone in need and choosing to make a difference, no matter how small. As the years passed, Ethan grew up to live by that lesson. Whether it was helping a friend or offering a kind word to someone having a bad day, he always remembered the impact of that single act of generosity. Supporting his mom or offering a kind word to a stranger, Ethan made it his mission to pass on the compassion he had been shown that day. And in the end, isn't that the kind of world we all want to live in? One where small acts of kindness create ripples that grow into waves of change. So if there's one thing to take away from this story, it's this: never underestimate the power of a single moment, a single action, to change someone's life. And, who knows, maybe that one act will inspire them to pass it on. If this story touched your heart, make sure to subscribe and share it with someone who could use a little reminder about the beauty of kindness. Melania's eyes flicked toward the black SUV parked nearby. It hadn't been there when she arrived, and now it loomed like a silent shadow, its tinted windows concealing whoever or whatever was inside. The sight made her stomach tighten. Something was definitely off. Then she noticed something else. Near the nose of the jet, two men in dark suits stood deep in conversation. Their gestures were sharp, their voices too low to carry across the tarmac. They weren't part of her usual crew. She'd never seen them before. Who were they? And why were they here? "Paul," she said again, her voice cutting through the heavy air. "If you think I'm going to walk away from this without answers, you don't know me very well." Paul glanced nervously at the men in suits before looking back at her. "Ma'am, I can't say anything more. Please just go back to the terminal. This is for your own safety." "My safety?" she repeated, her tone sharp and incredulous. Her piercing gaze stayed fixed on Paul, demanding the truth he was too afraid to reveal. Melania's voice was sharp now, her disbelief clear. "You think denying me access to my own plane and hiding behind vague excuses is keeping me safe? You're lying to me, Paul, and I don't take kindly to liars." Paul's face flushed red, his internal struggle plain for anyone to see. He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "Mrs. Trump, I swear to you I don't want to do this. But there's more going on here than you realize. I'm following orders because I don't have a choice." "There's always a choice," Melania shot back, her tone icy. "And you're making the wrong one." Before Paul could reply, one of the suited men broke away from his conversation and strode toward them with purpose. His expression was grim, and his imposing presence was amplified by his broad shoulders and the dark glasses hiding his eyes. "Captain Brennan," the man said, his voice clipped and authoritative, "we need a word. Now." Paul hesitated, glancing back at Melania, torn. But after a brief moment, he stepped away reluctantly, following the man. The suited man gestured for Paul to join him a few steps away. Their conversation began immediately, their words too low to hear but their tense, body language unmistakable. Melania's sharp eyes stayed fixed on them, her mind racing. Something was being kept from her, something big, and she was determined to uncover it. The conversation between Paul and the suited man was hushed, but Melania caught fragments, words, like classified and protocol, that only deepened her suspicions. Her phone buzzed in her hand, and she saw it was her assistant calling. She answered quickly, her tone sharp and efficient. "I'm being denied access to my jet. Find out who authorized this and get back to me immediately." Hanging up, her gaze shifted back to Paul and the suited man. Paul looked increasingly uneasy, his shoulders rigid and his head bobbing slightly, as if reluctantly agreeing to whatever he was being told. When the suited man finally walked away, Paul returned to her, his face pale, his movements stiff, almost mechanical. "Mrs. Trump," he said, his voice quieter than before, almost pleading. "Please, I'm asking you one last time. Go back to the terminal. I can't let you on this flight." Melania's expression was cold and unyielding. "And I'm telling you one last time, Paul. I'm not leaving without an explanation." Paul opened his mouth, as though to respond, but no words came. He seemed trapped, torn between his orders and the woman standing before him, refusing to back down. Hesitation spoke volumes, and Melania knew she had him cornered whatever he wasn't. Saying whatever orders he was following, it was clear this situation wasn't just about protocol. It was personal, and she wasn't about to back down. Paul Brennan felt his chest tighten as he stood frozen in front of Melania Trump. He had flown countless VIPs over his 2 decades as a pilot, but this was unlike anything he'd ever experienced. The weight of his orders, the looming presence of the suited agents, and the intensity of Melania's piercing gaze, it all bore down on him like a storm he couldn't escape. Paul had always prided himself on being professional, but now he found himself questioning everything, the orders he'd received that morning had been vague but direct ground the flight deny passenger. When access under all circumstances, do not disclose the reason, comply with further instructions. From Paul's hesitation spoke volumes, and Melania knew she had him cornered. Whatever he wasn't saying, whatever orders he was following, it was clear this situation wasn't just about protocol. It was personal, and she wasn't going to back down. Paul Brennan felt his chest tighten as he stood frozen before Melania Trump. In his 2 decades as a pilot, he had flown countless VIPs, but nothing like this. The weight of his orders, the looming presence of the suited agents, and the force of Melania's piercing gaze all bore down on him like a storm. The email had come from an unfamiliar address, but the directives were backed by official-sounding language and a chilling promise of severe consequences for disobedience. When he'd called the airline for clarification, he was redirected to a government contact who confirmed the instructions. What troubled Paul most, though, wasn't the secrecy. It was the tone. There had been no mention of technical issues, no explanation about potential threats. Just a chilling warning: for her safety, keep her off the plane. Paul's mind raced as he looked at Melania, standing firm on the tarmac with the quiet authority of someone who'd spent years navigating powerful, high-stakes situations. She wasn't just angry, she was suspicious, and that suspicion was a ticking time bomb. He hesitated, his fingers brushing the edge of the clipboard he carried, as if the papers it held could somehow offer some kind of answer, a way out of the corner he'd found himself in. The weight of his decisions, of the instructions he had, no choice but to follow, pressed on him. But no matter how much he tried to convince himself, something about this didn't feel right. "Mrs. Trump," Paul said carefully, his voice trying to offer reassurance. "You're not just a passenger. Your safety is paramount, and that's why these measures are in place. I can't say more, but I need you to trust that this is for the best." Melania's eyes narrowed, a look of disbelief crossing her face. "You keep saying this is for my safety, but you can't give me one concrete reason why. Do you even know why you're doing this, or are you just following orders like a robot?" Paul flinched at her words. They cut deep, not because they were harsh, but because they were true. He didn't know why he was doing this. He didn't know who had issued the orders or what they were trying to protect her from. All he knew was that his career, his reputation, and perhaps even his freedom were on the line if he disobeyed. He glanced toward the black SUV again. The men inside hadn't moved, but their presence hung over him like an invisible weight. The presence of the men in the SUV loomed over Paul like a shadow, weighing on him. He thought about his family, his wife, his 2 kids, and the life he had built through years of hard work. Was he willing to risk all of that? His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of his name. One of the agents, Agent Graham, approached with quick, deliberate steps. "Captain Brennan." "A word," Graham said, his tone sharp and commanding. Paul nodded, then turned back to Melania. "Please, ma'am. Wait here." Melania crossed her arms but didn't argue, her sharp gaze following Paul as he walked a few paces. "Away with Graham." "Captain," Graham began in a low voice, "you're doing fine. Stick to the plan. Keep her off the plane and out of the loop. This isn't a negotiation." Paul's jaw tightened. "I understand that, but I don't feel like I've been given enough information to handle this properly," Paul said, his voice betraying a hint of uncertainty. "She's asking questions I can't answer, and it's only escalating." "That's not your concern," Graham replied, his tone cold and authoritative. "Your job is to follow orders, not question them. The less you know, the safer you are, got it? Paul didn't respond immediately. He glanced back at Melania, standing near the stairs with a calm but determined expression, then at the black SUV. The words, "The less you know, the safer you are," echoed in his mind. "What exactly is on that plane?" Paul finally asked. Graham's face darkened, his eyes narrowing. "You don't want to know, Captain. Trust me on that. Just do your job." As Graham walked away, Paul stood in silence, his thoughts swirling. He looked back at Melania, who hadn't moved. Her patience was clearly wearing thin, but her resolve was stronger than ever. Paul knew he was running out of time to make a choice. He could either keep following orders and live with the guilt of never knowing the truth, or he could take a stand and risk everything. Everything. Paul Brennan returned to the base of the stairs, the weight of Graham's words pressing heavily on his shoulders. He looked at Melania Trump, who was now pacing slightly, her frustration barely concealed behind her composed exterior. Every instinct he had screamed that the situation was far more dangerous than anyone was letting on. He just didn't know how far it went, or how much danger they were really in. Melania stopped pacing when she saw Paul approach. Her eyes narrowed. "Well," she demanded, "are you ready to explain what's really going on? Or am I supposed to keep playing this guessing game?" Paul hesitated, his gaze flicking between the jet and the black SUV still parked ominously in the distance. He was torn, caught between the orders he'd been given and the growing realization that something was deeply wrong. "Mrs. Trump," he began carefully, his voice low but steady, "I've done everything by the book my entire career, but right now I'm not sure if following orders is the right thing to do," Paul said, his voice filled with uncertainty. Her expression softened just slightly, but her voice remained firm. "Then do the right thing, Paul. Tell me what you know." Before Paul could respond, a low hum emanated from the direction of the plane. Melania and Paul turned simultaneously, their attention immediately drawn to the cockpit. The plane's auxiliary power unit had been engaged, and the faint vibration in the air was unmistakable. Someone was preparing the jet for departure. Paul's stomach sank. "Who's in the cockpit?" He muttered more to himself than anyone else. Melania didn't wait for him to answer. She moved toward the stairs with a purposeful stride, but Paul stepped in front of her again, blocking her path. "Mrs. Trump, wait." "For what?" she shot back, her voice rising slightly. "Someone's about to take off in my plane, and I'm supposed to stand here and let it happen." Paul's hands clenched at his sides. "Let me check first if this is what I think it is." He trailed off, his voice tight with unease. His mind raced as he stood there, frozen by the urgency of the situation. Melania didn't move, but her eyes bore into him with intensity. "You have 5 minutes, Paul," she said, her voice steady, yet laced with determination. "Then I'm going up there myself." Paul nodded quickly, his heart pounding as he hurried up the stairs. His shoes thudded against the metal steps, echoing in the tense silence. When he reached the cockpit, he found the door locked. He knocked sharply, his voice firm. "This is Captain Brennan. Open the door." For a moment, there was silence. Then the door cracked open just enough for Paul to see a man's face, a face he didn't recognize. The man, disheveled and pale, glanced at Paul with wide, frantic eyes before quickly shutting the door again. Paul's heart raced. Whoever this man was, he wasn't part of the crew. He knocked again, harder this time. "Open the door now, or I'll override it." Inside, he heard the man speaking hurriedly, but the words were muffled. Paul didn't wait for an answer. His instincts told him something was terribly wrong. He reached for the emergency override panel, inputting the code that would grant him access. The door clicked open, and Paul stepped inside. What he saw made him freeze. In the cockpit, the man from earlier sat in the co-pilot seat, his hands trembling, as he clutched a tablet displaying encrypted messages. Behind him, strapped to the floor, was a large unmarked crate, secured with reinforced locks. The surface of the crate bore no labels or markings except for a faint emblem Paul immediately recognized, the seal of a major government agency. The man in the co-pilot seat turned to Paul, his voice shaking. I didn't have a choice. They told me I'd be safe if I just did what they said. Paul stepped closer, his voice calm but firm. Who are you? And what's in the crate? The man shook his head, tears welling in his eyes. I can't. They'll kill me if I talk. You're already here, Paul said, his tone hardening. They can't do anything worse. Whatever's happening, it's already out of your hands, Paul said softly. But if you tell me what's going on, I can help. The man hesitated, then glanced at the crate. It's not just cargo, he whispered. It's evidence, files, recordings, everything they don't want the public to see. Paul's breath caught. Evidence of what? Crimes, the man replied, his voice barely audible. Powerful people, corruption. They're using this flight to move it somewhere no one can find it. Paul's mind reeled as the implications sank. And this wasn't about safety or protocol. It was about burying the truth. He turned to the man. And you? Why are you here? I'm the one who leaked it, the man admitted, his voice breaking. They caught me, but they need me alive to decode the files. If I don't go with them, the crate is useless. Paul felt a chill run through him. He looked back at the crate, then at the man. We're not letting this plane take off, he said firmly. Stay here. He hurried back down the stairs to where Melania awaited. Her arms were crossed, her expression unreadable. Expression tense. What's on that plane, she demanded. Paul didn't mince words, evidence enough to ruin some very powerful people, and a man who says they'll kill him if he doesn't comply. Melania's face darkened. They're using my plane to cover up a crime, yes, Paul said. And we need to stop them before they succeed. The pieces of the puzzle had finally fallen into place, and the stakes were higher than anyone could have imagined. But the question remained, how far were they willing to go to ensure the truth? Came out the air around the jet felt charged as if the tension of the situation had a physical weight. Paul Brennan stood at the bottom of the stairs, his mind racing the revelation of what was on the plane, the crate filled with evidence, and the terrified man forced to transport it, was more than he could slamming shut. Interrupted their conversation. The tension in the air thickened as the black SUV's doors opened and the agents inside began to step out. Paul's heart raced. There was no more time for deliberation. The window to stop the flight was closing rapidly. Melania's voice cut through his thoughts like a knife. What do we do now, Paul? Her calm yet commanding tone made it clear that she wasn't asking for his opinion. She was demanding a solution. Paul looked back toward the plane, then to the black SUV parked nearby. The agents inside were watching. Closely now, their silhouettes barely visible through the tinted windows. His gut told him they weren't just there to monitor. They were there to ensure this operation went off without a hitch. And if that meant silencing anyone who got in, their way, Paul had no doubt they would do it. We need to ground this plane permanently, Paul said, his voice low but firm. If it takes off, the evidence in that man are as good as gone. Melania nodded, her expression hardening with determination. Then let's ground it. But before they could act, the sound of car doors slamming shut echoed in the air.